It is time to check in with Amanda Lang, host of Taking Stock, which airs, of course, Friday nights here, 6 o'clock on BNN Bloomberg and the iHeart Radio network. Amanda, there's actually a lot of business news today. Let's start off with one that just broke not that long ago. Canada's Competition Bureau says, okay, RBC can acquire the Canadian banking operations of HSBC. Is this a surprise?
It is maybe a little bit of a surprise. Not a huge one. This is the HSBC Bank Canada. It's a $13.5 billion banking takeover, so it's not nothing. What I found most interesting about this that I think will resonate with a lot of Canadians is the Bureau said it doesn't. It's not a substantial lessening or a prevention of competition, but they noted that there is already a bit of a lack of competition between the banks. So they're kind of giving a nod to the fact that they don't love the situation, but that they don't see that this is a big tipping point either.
Okay, $13 billion, not significant. That's pretty amazing to hear.
Yeah. Well, I mean, just for the banks of this size, HSBC in Canada is the seventh largest bank, so it's not as though it's immaterial, but it's not massive in this country.
Okay, let's move on to this story then. A new report finding non-permanent residents in Canada undercounted by 1 million. So what kind of an impact does an underestimated population count have on things like, I don't know, housing, I guess, and budgets, Amanda?
Yeah, I mean, a huge one, really. This comes courtesy of Benny Tal over at CIBC, who does great work on this kind of stuff, just crunching the data. And his point is, there are assumptions made that when people come to Canada on a temporary visa, that they then leave at the end of it. And that just is not the case. And so CIBC is estimating it's this million extra people. And housing is a big one, Natasha, that we're kind of focused on because we talk a lot about how much more housing we need. We haven't counted the million people. Those may be renters. So when you talk about how tight the rental market is, the record high levels of rent in our urban centers, that's putting pressure on that market. And so it does kind of exacerbate the situation and gives us an inaccurate picture of how to solve it. And then there's a whole bunch of other services, right? Think healthcare. Think anything else that people will tap while they're here. And not counting is kind of a material problem. There's a plus side, right? Those are consumers. They're also consuming things from our businesses. So it's not as though there isn't an upside to this, but it's important that we measure it more accurately.
Have we been doing this wrong all along?
I think if there's just been assumptions made that, I guess so, yes. I haven't dug back into history just to know whether this is a new phenomenon. I think, though, maybe, yes, there has always been an assumption that people don't overstay their visas. I think it's happening at a bigger rate now than it would have historically, but probably this has been going on for a few years.
Well, right, and I guess they're not contributing. They might be paying GST and PST, but they're not paying taxes, and yet they're taking advantage of those services, perhaps, or not. If they're not paying taxes, maybe they're not accessing the services, Amanda?
No, this is an important point because it does speak to a big and growing underground economy. Always a problem for us, right? When your service provider says if you pay cash, you're going to save on the tax. What you're contributing to there is the gray market economy that's not being taxed. And you're right. If people aren't being so-called counted, if they're here illegally because their visa expired, they're probably doing valuable work. I'm guessing, right? They came in as a temporary worker. They're probably still working. But yeah, they're not going to pay tax on that income. They will spend the income, but they probably also aren't walking into clinics and using the healthcare system either because they don't have any kind of authenticity to show that they deserve that. So it becomes this kind of gray population that exists among us that are neither benefiting nor contributing.
So I want to shift, if we can, to another story that I think caught a lot of people by surprise, and that is the Premier of British Columbia, David Eby, reaching out directly to Tiff Macklin at the Bank of Canada and basically saying, look, you got to stop with these further interest rate hikes. His words, they are hurting Canadians, and there's a human impact here that the Bank of Canada should be considering. I don't remember ever hearing about, first of all, anyone in government reaching out to the Bank of Canada. That's a separate arm of not government. First of all, what's your reaction to this, and do you think this has any impact at all?
I don't think it'll have an impact on the Bank of Canada, and nor should it. The Bank of Canada is not a kind of a politically swayed body. It operates on its own agenda. He's definitely the first premier to do this. We do, of course, get federally opposition politicians often complaining about rate hikes in the bank. It's an easy target. They would likely change their tune once they're in government because we do take the separation of kind of the church and state of the Bank of Canada and the political arm of government really seriously. It just speaks to what a hot button issue it is, that we know now that raising rates is the cure, but that as it's curing, it's really causing suffering for a lot of people. There isn't a quick fix on that. I think that buried in this letter from the Premier is the important point, which is more work needs to be done on things like housing to help people out. That's not the Bank of Canada's role. That is more, he should be writing to the Prime Minister if that's what he's looking for, or to his own municipal leadership. But it's an interesting kind of political play, and I think it's probably, to me, it's more politics than it is kind of real economic policy making.
You know, I wonder, though, as I read, sort of just glance at this statement, he also points out, and we've talked about this before, right? So the biggest, I guess, driver of inflation is rising mortgage rates. I wonder maybe his issue should be with the banks and not with the Bank of Canada.
Well, there's that, although, of course, we do expect our banks to kind of cushion themselves against default, and we want the system to be stable. I mean, one thing that is really interesting to kind of remember about our system is there's no such thing as a 30-year mortgage in this country, right? Our mortgages may have long amortizations, and a growing number of them are way beyond 30 years, as we know, but they reset every 5 years. So that's where the pain point comes is, you know, whatever mortgage rate you lock in, it's relatively short term. And the big question we have to start asking is, when they reset, and for a lot of people that's going to be 24, 25, there was a big kind of bulge of mortgages in pandemic. Will the rates be higher? Will they be lower? Will they be back where they were? And I think we can make some educated guesses that they'll be closer to where they are today than they were in 2020.
Okay, well, while we're talking about mortgages, let's move on to talking about the housing bubble, because one analyst is saying that we're sitting on a huge housing bubble, and in terms of that bubble bursting, he said that it's not imminent, but it's pretty much inevitable. Do you agree with that statement, Amanda, and what would the repercussions be?
I think it's probably an extreme statement. I mean, I definitely think that the point that he makes that I think is well taken is that if you look at assets to income, debt to income, we are in a precarious place. So our incomes relative to our mortgages does look dicey. There's no question about that. However, the reason why I would say calling it a bubble is a bit of a stretch is we've seen banks, first of all, working with customers, those longer amortizations. That's one way to make sure people have more time to get where they need to go and figure out how to make their balance, but their budget balance. The bigger question is the supply-demand picture just doesn't really set us up for a crash. It just doesn't. I mean, we've got a strong labor market. We've got huge immigration. We just, as we discussed, have 1 million people we're not even counting. Mm-hmm. So it's hard to see, even if people have to walk away from mortgages, that there aren't other buyers out there. Could there be a big correction? I still think there could be in one scenario, but the labor market's not really pointing that direction right now.
You know, you wonder, I keep coming back to banks. So we know that the loan loss provisions at banks keep going up and up and up. We saw numbers from some of the big banks this week, not doing as well perhaps as analysts had predicted. Is that a fly in the ointment here, or just one-time sort of happening, do you think?
I think the banks still have a little bit of that kind of pain to deal with, as long as they're carrying these mortgages and that they're going to have to. There will be some defaults, so they're being very they're obviously being very conservative about making sure they have the capital on hand. The difference between us and the U.S., of course, that went through the horrible mortgage-led credit crisis in 2007 and 8, is our banks will not. They're not unstable. They won't fail, and that's because we have all of these safeguards in place, including how much capital we insist that they have set aside. So, I guess the one thing I would say with the banks is, could they afford to Natasha's point, slow their roll a little bit on raising their mortgage rates, take a hit to their profit? Nobody's asking them to do that yet, but politically, that might be one question you see raised.
Politically, there's that word, politically, when we talk business. Mm-hmm. Amanda, thank you so much. Appreciate the time.
Always a pleasure.
Have a great weekend.